All right, it's about that time. Welcome, glad that y'all are here. There are lots of treats and stuff in the back, and I feel like a lot of people were bashful about not getting them, so help yourself to them. I want to welcome you. Welcome to our weekend workshop. My name is Matt, if I haven't met you. I'm really excited to introduce our new friend, Jim Davis, for lots of reasons, but one in particular is he has thought deeply about a question that a lot of people have felt personally in recent years, which is why have so many people left the church, and then what does faithfulness look like kind of in our current moment. So I want to give you some info about Jim, just so you know who he is. He was born in Orlando. He went to RTS Orlando. He currently serves as the teaching pastor of Orlando Grace Church. His favorite actor is Orlando Bloom. He went to Florida State University. He's married to his wife, Angela. They have 4 children. He is the host of the As in Heaven podcast, which is on the Gospel Coalition Podcast Network. He's the co-author of that book, which if you haven't read it yet, I would highly recommend you doing so. He also serves on the council of the Gospel Coalition, and Jim and his wife are regular speakers at Family Life's Weekend to Remember Marriage conferences, as well as Pine Cove Family Camp, which is where I went as a 3rd grader. Huh. If that wasn't enough to kind of give you just a high-level overview of Jim, I threw his bio into ChatGPT, and here's how it suggested that I introduce him. Joining us, Jim Davis is a judicious, joyful, Jesus-loving journeyman of justification and joy. Jim juggles jobs, joining the jaded, the joyless, and the just trying to Jesus. This is my favorite sentence. Jim jointly jotted the great Dechurching, a judicious journal justifying why Jillians are jettisoning church, and joyfully, gently, Jesus' word, how to journey them back. Jim's judicious, jargon light, just right Jeremiads jolt us from jadedness and jet us toward Jesus, the just judge and justifier. Jim, join us. Jump up. Justly jam us with the joyful gospel. That's what it said. Very juvenile. So let's welcome our new friend, Jim Davis, and he can take it from there.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Matt. I as you started reading, I was thinking that ChatGPT knew that I was a Baptist and alliterated the whole thing. But I went to RTS Orlando. My mom calls me a Baptarian because I'm like the closest you can get to Presbyterianism without the baptism thing. But I feel more comfortable in Presbyterian circles than I do most Baptist circles. And you make me feel really at home because nobody sits in the front rows. That's just like my church. It really is so good to be with y'all. I pastored for 6 years in Oxford, Mississippi. My wife went to Ole Miss. Anybody go to Ole Miss here? All right. I pastored Grace Bible Church. Anybody know Grace Bible Church? I know Austin does. Okay. Yeah. Yep. It's a great church. And so we know Memphis well. We used to joke that people would try to our friends would try to understand Oxford, and we loved Oxford. But we'd have to tell them, like, we literally have to leave the state to go to a Target, an Apple store, an airport. Like, Memphis was our place. So we spent a lot of time up here, and it really is fun to be back here. And I'll be honest, I've not spent a lot of time in Midtown, so it's been really fun seeing Midtown. So thank you. I did know Austin back in my campus ministry days. I was with Campus Crusade at Mississippi State. How many of y'all went to Mississippi State? Okay, some of you. I know Austin has 2 hands up. So I'm excited for what we get to cover. I do kind of want to let you know the plan over tonight and tomorrow morning. We're going to start kind of high-level data and trends, okay? So some of you love data. Others of you are just like, get to the practical stuff. Tell me what to do. And hopefully, over the course of our 3 sessions, we will be able to hit all of you. But I think it's really helpful to know when we get to the more practical stuff, where it is that it comes from. So we're going to start higher level. And I want to start, let me see if I can, would you prefer me stand up here? I'll try to be up here. You see, it's not a big difference. So I want to start with a little bit of like how we got here. Is that going to... That didn't work. Let me see. All right. There we go. How we got here. I never intended on writing a book. So I grew up in Orlando, Florida, and this story is, I think, is important even if you don't know or care about Orlando, because it's a story of cultural exegesis, kind of learning the culture of the city that you're in. Growing up in Orlando, I left Orlando when I was 18 to go to Florida State, would come back every now and then, but when I graduated Florida State, moved around the world for 15 years. Spent 5 years in Italy, a total of 11 years in the other foreign country that I've lived in, Mississippi, and loved it. But when I went back to Orlando, I realized I'm on one hand looking at Orlando through new eyes because I'd been away. On another hand, Orlando had actually really changed. When I left Orlando, it felt like I left, if a city was a person. I left Orlando when it was kind of this prepubescent, it's growing up, finding its place in the world, doesn't yet know how to handle big boy things like Shaquille O'Neal, but it's a larger city, but still trying to figure things out in a lot of ways, still trying to grow up. Coming back, I felt like it was more like a 22-year-old city, where it was all grown up, but really still trying to find its place in the world. And Mike Graham was my executive pastor then. Now he's the program director for the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics with the Gospel Coalition. And we just kind of wanted to understand the city that we lived in better so that we could be better at doing ministry in that city. And we were learning different things, looking, analyzing our city. But at some point, I feel like it was 2019, we came across a 2018 Barna study. And that study made the claim that Orlando had the same percentage of evangelicals as New York City and Seattle. Now, this was shocking to us because Orlando in many ways had all the signs of being like the Christian Mecca. In the church world, First Presbyterian Church was the second largest mainline church in the United States. You had, the First Baptist Church was booming. Their pastor is president of the Southern Baptist Convention. You had R.C. Sproul came down there, and with him, 2 more Presbyterian PCA churches. And you had, who else do we have in there? Joel Hunter. I wouldn't expect you to know this name, but he was pioneering the non-denominational space. He was advising presidents. You know, people can even forget, like, we had Benny Hinn and Paula White down the street slaying people in the spirit. Like, pick your, theological stream, and there was something there for you. And then institutionally, RTS came down to Orlando. Campus Crusade came down to Orlando. Of course, Ligonier with R.C. Sproul, Wycliffe. You have all these giant organizations coming to Orlando. That's all in the 90s and early 2000s. Now here we are in 2019, hearing from Barna that we have the same percentage of evangelicals as New York City and Seattle. So that was shocking in its own right. But then we started asking ourselves, but why does Orlando feel so different culturally than New York City or Seattle? And we started realizing anecdotally that a lot of our people, even though they didn't go to church, they still carried with them Christian values. In some cases, they seemed to be Christians, but they didn't go to church. And so we were looking at this, and that's starting to make sense. And we drilled down in this Barna study, and it said that there were about 2 million people in the greater Orlando area that used to go to church and now no longer don't. So this is kind of like 2 million people in the Orlando area that used to go to church, and they have, for whatever reason, decided they are no longer going to church. And we wanted to know more about it. The problem was we couldn't find anything more on it. We couldn't find, let me see if this is my next slide, the data that existed. It was old. It wasn't enough. It wasn't actionable pastorally, because ultimately we're not here just to find data. We want to understand our city so that we can reach the people in our city. The data also, we can talk about this in Q&A if you want, but the post-fracturing of evangelicalism, so there's a lot that changed between, let's say, actually, I would say there were some things building up to it, but I don't know if you remember the MLK conference that was hosted by TGC and the ERLC of the Southern Baptist Convention here in Memphis, the 50th anniversary. That was really the I don't know, the catalyst of the fracturing of evangelicalism. And so that had changed so much. There was zero data after that. And the data that existed was not academically credible data. That's not data that like the Washington Post or the New York Times would even look at, because it didn't carry, the science wasn't published. Some of the data results were behind paywalls. That's kind of looked down on in academic societies. And ultimately, we're just looking for reliable, granular insights that we could do something with the people in our community and our church. So our thesis was that this wasn't just an Orlando problem. Our thesis was this is probably something that's happening all over the United States, and that it is possible that we're in the largest and fastest religious shift in the history of our country. So that's the thesis. We didn't know how to prove it, but that's what we thought we were looking at. Now, anecdotally, there were two things that were really important for me along the way. First one, I was speaking at a fundraiser for a large ministry, and when I say speaking, I had 10 minutes. Like, it was a very short talk. It was on Dechurching. It was at the very beginning, and I was opening for Max Lucado. And I'd never met Max before, but you know, I opened. He went up, and he did a great job. And afterwards, there was kind of this surreal moment where I had this line of people to talk to me, and I look over, and Max is getting coffee by himself, which made no sense. Nobody knew who I was. He gave the great talk. He's Max. And as the line went through, I began to realize, when I talked about people who had left the church, I'm talking about their children, their grandchildren, their friends, their parents, their nephews, their nieces. And so it was just this moment that the Lord used to really tell me this isn't just about data. I say tell me, remind me in a deeper way. This isn't just about data. These are real people with real eternal souls. And so that impacted me. The other thing that happened was my wife was going to RTS Orlando to get her counseling degree at the time, and she was taking apologetics with Justin Holcomb. I don't know if any of you know Justin Holcomb, but he was teaching the class. And she wanted to do her final research paper on Dechurching. And Justin's a friend of mine, and he said, listen, I know Jim's interested in this, but there's nothing to research. Like, you can't do a paper on something where there is no real data out there. And so that, like, real people, real souls, there's really not anything out there. That caused Mike Graham and myself to want to do something bigger. I had no intentions of writing a book, but we commissioned Ryan Burge. So I don't know how many of you have heard of Ryan Burge. If you pay to follow one person on Substack, it's Ryan Burge. Like, he's become a lot. He was already quietly a big deal. Now he's publicly a big deal. But he is a Christian social scientist. And I always want to be careful when I say that, because it's not like Christian movies where you've got like the good ones and then the Christian ones. Like, he is a legit social scientist who also happens to be a Christian. And we, by God's grace, were able to raise $100,000 to do the largest academically peer-reviewed quantitative national survey on dechurching that had ever been done. Now, that might not sound so impressive now that you know there was nothing, but it was like a legit large study. And this is why one of the reasons books like this don't get written is because it costs so much just to do the research. You're never going to get, in the Christian world, $100,000 off of a book. And so we had some donors. They contributed to it. We didn't think we were going to write a book. We were going to use it to benefit Orlando, and we had this podcast that we could, make some of the data public. But we did the survey, and we did, in fact, definitively, academically prove that we are in the largest and fastest religious shift in the history of our country. So at that point, when we owned that data, that's when publishers wanted a book out of it. And we were happy to do something and bless the church. But that's kind of the journey. Like, that's how it happened. It wasn't planned. But when I say we're experiencing the largest and fastest religious shift in the history of our country, let's see if I may need to start hitting buttons. Let's see, a little technical difficulty. All right. So, this number is gonna grow in a little bit. By our research, 40 million people had left houses of worship over the past 25 years. Now, I say houses of worship because they all weren't Christian, but about 15 million from evangelical churches, about 20 million from mainline and Catholic churches combined, and about 5 million from houses of worship that we would not consider to be Christian in any way. Mormons, Jehovah's Witness, that kind of thing. So that number is larger than the First Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening, and all of the Billy Graham's crusades combined. As far as, of course, we're a larger country now, but if you want to go at it like by percentages, the previous largest shift that we've had in our country were the 25 years post-Civil War, and that our shift, post-Civil War, people were going to the church. That was the shift. They were immigrating, coming to the church. They'd gone to war and come back to church. Some of them had not gone to church, gone to war, and gone to church after it. But that was our biggest shift, this huge group of people moving toward church. Our shift, just in terms of percentage of the population, is 25% greater than that, going, obviously, the opposite direction. So how do we define dechurching? We defined a dechurched person as someone who used to go to church at least on a monthly basis, who now goes to church one time a year or less. Or they say less than about one time a year. This says less than once per year. So the reason that that's important is because there are people who go to church, let's just say, every Easter or every other Easter, or every Christmas Eve or every other Christmas Eve. Well, in our study, those are churched people, because we want to be conservative in the way that we report this. So we knew going in that number was probably greater than 40 million. And this is an interesting time. I haven't said this publicly. I've got to be careful how I say it. Mike Graham and Ryan Burge, about a year and a half ago, decided that they wanted to do the largest religious survey in the history of the world. I was invited to be a part of it. I had some major health issues that prevented me from being a part of it, which is probably good. They're the data guys. Like, I'm the pastor in the group. When the data started coming back initially, they're looking at the screen and they're so excited, and I felt like I'm looking at the Matrix. I didn't, but they would say it really had to go through me for anybody else to understand it. But they have now completed the largest religious survey in the history of the world. And I can't give the data, but I can tell you that the dechurching phenomenon that we're seeing is larger than what we even reported, even with the conservative data, because they have just an absolutely huge data set. So it's very important how we define that, combined with the current research they're doing. We also learned that most of the dechurching has happened in the past 25 years. So it's been accelerating. The type of person who's dechurched in the past 25 years has shifted, and we're going to look at that. You can see here, though, this is 1910, this graph, to 2021. And let's say, that's 1991. See, I hit the light, and now the other thing's working. Okay. So 1991 is here. 1999 is here. So really in that realm, you can see on the graph, that is the big spike in dechurching. Now, all good social scientists would tell you spikes like this don't come out of nowhere. There have been things way back here preparing for it, and they're right. I don't have time to get into that. But you can see the 90s is the inflection point, and we're going to talk about why that is too. One other thing that I want you to see. This is a long-standing, super reliable graph on the relationship between economic development in a country and that country's religiosity. Now, I know you probably can't see all the little type here, but over here, you have very low economic development, very high religiosity. So Ethiopia, Senegal, Bangladesh, Iraq, India. That's what's up here. Over here, you have very high economic development, low religiosity. So you have Switzerland, Ireland, Norway. This is a very proven relationship. But then you have this one little green dot up here that just doesn't seem to fit. That's the United States of America. We are what social scientists call stubbornly religious. We don't fit the trends. Now, this is important because if return to the mean is a thing, and it is, humanly speaking, you can see how much farther we could go before we fit into the nice little graph there. Not trying to fearmonger or anything, just showing like the truth is our friend. So that's the truth. Now, all right, sorry, I don't know what's going on with this guy. All right. So when we look at the 40 million, it's about 15% of all Americans have dechurched. It's about 40 million. 15 million of these are evangelicals. Again, all these numbers we would say are larger now. We were trying to be conservative. Mike and Ryan now have data that will come out in the next year that show that this is, in fact, larger than those numbers. So why the 1990s? There are four main things that contributed nationwide to what we're seeing. The first is the fall of the Soviet Union. Does anybody have any guess as to why the fall of the Soviet Union impacted dechurching in the United States? It's fascinating to me. So during the Cold War, you had this battle between the communist atheists and the Christian Americans. I'm old enough to remember, and some of you are older than me, a time where if somebody would have said, I'm no longer a Christian, what was the very next question that somebody would ask? Are you a communist? Like, is it dead serious? Like, if you're old, as old as I am or older, can you verify that is a real thing? Like, that was a real thing. So it's no coincidence that during the phrases "in God we trust" and "under God," "in God we trust on the money," "under God on our money," on our pledge, that happened during the Cold War. That was Eisenhower. Like, that was Cold War propaganda to perpetuate this idea that there are these atheist communists versus Christian Americans. And so that kept a lot of Christians who probably weren't Christians, but created this societal pressure to maintain that label, go to church because you don't want to be un-American. Well, when the Soviet Union fell, there was now freedom in the United States to be both a good American and not a Christian. Now, that was maybe not as true in Oxford, Mississippi, as it was in New York City, but that freedom was introduced into many parts of the United States. Second, you had the rise of the religious right, this syncretism between evangelicalism specifically and the Republican Party. And I'm not trying to get too political here, but there was enough syncretization that there were many people who said, if that's what Christianity is, I'm out. Whereas most of us would say Christianity does give us the freedom to disagree with all the ways evangelicalism and right-wing political theory had merged. So it caused a lot of people to say, I'm out. You have the rise of the internet. The first internet cafes popped up around 1994, and there was freedom to explore worldviews without the peer pressure of having to be something that your parents or friends wanted you to be. And even though internet by like 97 was only in around 20% of the homes, it was in not only internet cafes, but it was in every school and library pretty much around. So everybody had access to the World Wide Web, and that changed things. And then lastly, 9/11. So historically speaking, it's fascinating that 1989, 1990, our existential enemies, the United States existential enemies, were the atheist communists, and then 10 years later, it's the religious fundamentalists, Islamist religious fundamentalists, but it was the religious fundamentalists. And so you had a lot of people saying, see, that's what religion does, I'm out. Now, we would argue that for all of that, it really just gave freedom in the 1990s for people who were not Christians to be open with the fact that they were not Christians. That none of those things, we would argue that those things didn't have a huge impact in actually pushing Christians out the door. It opened the doors for those who were not Christians to be open with that fact. All right, so now we get to the question, why are people leaving? And there are two really common, we might say two old stories. If your information diet is more from the left, you're going to hear that it's the church's fault. It happened because of scandal, racism, misogyny, clergy abuse, Christian nationalism. It's the church's fault, largely, that people are leaving the church. If your information diet is more to the right, you're going to hear it's the culture's fault. It is secular progressivism, the sexual revolution. That's why people are leaving the church. That's who's taking our young people out of the church. Now, what's interesting, it was very interesting and surprising to us, both of those stories are true and both are horribly wrong. They're both true in that, yes, you find those stories. They're wrong in that if you add up all of those stories together, you still don't get close to the top reasons for dechurching. Does anybody, some of you may know, does anybody know the number one reason for dechurching in the United States of America? Any guesses? Austin. I moved. I moved is the number one reason. So where does that fit in these two stories? It doesn't. So what we realized is of the 40 million, 30 million we call the casually dechurched. They dechurched without really any pain points. There was no specific impetus. They moved. Attending for some reason became inconvenient. There was a family change that we're going to dial into in just a little bit. They might have been divorced, become a single parent, had a child, but 30 million of the 40 million, so 3/4 dechurched for very mundane reasons that you're just not going to hear about on Twitter and in the New York Times. People aren't going to read these stories. Now, 10 million, yes. These are who we call the dechurched casualties. And by the way, I see some of you taking notes. You're free to. I'm happy to give this presentation to Matt or whoever, and so you can just focus and have that. So 10 million dechurched casualties. These are people who felt like they didn't fit within the congregation. There was suffering. There was church hurt. There was clergy scandal. So we don't want to minimize those stories. In the book, we do really address those stories because there's some things the church really needs to learn. But as we're studying the national landscape, it is very helpful for us to see that that's not every story. And we're going to get very practical, I'll leave in a little practical here in talking about why. These people, the dechurched, they are not a homogenous group. They're very different people. And we want to be able to understand what kind of dechurched person we're looking at so that we can respond to them in a way that is most helpful to bring them either to Jesus or back to the church. And some of the people, all they need is a nudge. And we're going to look at this group. Some of them do need to be at the dinner table before they're ever going to be in a church. And others are going to need years of relationship and the Holy Spirit to do something that only the Holy Spirit can do before they're ever going to find themselves back in the church. So my hope, moving from this slide, is to really understand how can we see the different de-church people for who they are. And the more that I've understood this and implemented in my own personal ministry, in my neighborhood, in my gym, wherever else, this has been hugely helpful for me. So I want to just look at evangelicals, de-church evangelicals for a minute. So 15 million people. Again, it's probably more. We're going to stick with 15 million for our purposes here. And we took all of the answers and ran them through what is called machine learning. So this is an algorithm that takes massive amounts of data and creates profiles based on common question answers. That's a weird way of saying it. Common answers to our questions. And so we got these, it could have been 2, it could have been 8, it could have been 10, it kind of just depends on the data. But the algorithm said, you have 4 clear profiles here. Then we needed to study the profiles to understand what we're looking at, and we had to give them each a name. So the 4 profiles we named: cultural Christians, mainstream evangelicals, not to be confused with mainline, mainstream evangelicals. The third category, ex-evangelicals, we didn't coin that term. We tried to avoid that term, and you'll see in a little bit why we stayed with that term. And then number 4, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and persons of color. So I want to look at these 4 for just a little bit and understand how each profile is unique so that we can begin to recognize these people as we interact with them in our daily lives. So first, the cultural Christians. Of the 15 million, this is 8 million of them. This is a huge group. This group de-churched casually. 90% de-churched casually. This group is overwhelmingly white, 98% white. More male than female. The average age is about 40 to 45, and they've been out of church between 11 and 14 years on the average. So they have a positive view of the church. They might still get married in a church, buried in the church. If I were to tell them that I'm a pastor, they wouldn't look at me as if I have a third eye. They have a positive view of the church. Above average income, above average education. None of that is super surprising until you get to their orthodoxy scores. And when I say orthodoxy scores, we're not quizzing them on the 5 points and the 5 solas or anything like that. We're just Nicene Creed Christianity. Very, very middle of the road Christian faith. When we did that, this group had a 56% orthodoxy score, which is low, but we isolated the question, is Jesus the Son of God? And only 1% of the 8 million answered that question yes. They largely call themselves Christians, have a positive view of the church, would get married or buried in the church, no pain points. 1% believes that Jesus is the Son of God. So you can see why we name them cultural Christians. You're going to see a huge number of these in Memphis, Tennessee, in the South. People who retain Christian values, want their kids to have Christian values, but it does not seem like there are very many in this group who are actually Christians. That's not surprising. Pretty low view of the Bible. 22% believe that the Bible is the literal Word of God. Now, here's one thing I need to acknowledge, that the phrasing of that, the Bible is the literal Word of God, is problematic. Because what do you mean by literal? Reformed people would, with the way we understand the Bible, our hermeneutics, would understand there's a lot that's not literal. Most Reformed people are going to understand Revelation in a very different way than dispensationals. That's not what we're talking about here. And the literal and symbolic come into play in Revelation. What this means is it's spoken by God, and we had to use those words to be able to, because this is the way the question has been asked for about 80 years. So in social science, we had to stick with certain questions the way they've been asked. Even so, that's a low number. That's a low percentage. 22% believe that the Bible is the literal word of God. This group, center left politically, 54% of them, so over half would say, yeah, racial issues are just kind of not there. They're isolated, they're rare, not a big deal. That's going to come back later on. U.S. institutions largely work well for this group. When we ask this group why they left, all right, over the course of this, we're going to see a theme that we're going to tie together at the very end. They said, attending was inconvenient. My friends were not attending worship. I moved to a new community. Suffering changed my views of God and or the congregation. So I'm going to get to suffering in just a second. In the first three, what common theme do you see? Friends, community, that there wasn't a community to keep them involved when things got difficult. And I would say this suffering you would put under the category of normal, like living in a fallen world. This is not the kind of suffering that comes at the hands of an abusive pastor. This is life got hard and I just walked away. Number 5, I wanted to be able to personally express my gender identity. This is the only place that showed up largely in this study. Issues of gender identity, sexual identity, LGBTQ stuff was shockingly not in the data. It was just not. It was not a reason for dechurching. This is the only place that showed up at all, and it's very small in the large scheme of things. Number 6, I chose to worship completely online. I have lots of thoughts. We'll talk about tomorrow some on how we use the internet and worship and things like that. Number 7, scandal involving the clergy in the broader culture. So we still haven't gotten to any real church hurt. It was like, hey, I heard about something going on in the broader culture. I think I'm just going to do something else. So we're seeing somebody that was never actually rooted in the gospel, and they use that as a reason to leave. Number 8, I felt the church was being too restrictive of my sexual freedom. That is not an identity issue. This is largely heterosexual. I want to sleep with my boyfriend or girlfriend. The church looked down on that, so that was one of the reasons that I left. For this group, what they said might cause them to return. New friends. Lonely and want to make new friends. Again, this pattern we're going to see. Supernatural phenomenon. So the way that I would define supernatural phenomenon, it's like they come back to their house and their Bible is floating on the table. That's what they mean by supernatural phenomenon here. Begin to miss church. Number 4, friends invite me. Spouse wants to go. Move and want to make new friends. I can find a good community. So we're seeing this relational aspect continuing to develop. What do cultural Christians need? They do need sincere community, as all of us do. The mental health help we're going to talk about tomorrow more is a real thing. Mental health needs are real. They need it very significantly. They need churches with sound doctrine and spiritual formation, because it does not seem like either A, they ever had it, or B, they ever were open to it. And then 4th, better engagement in the 18 to 39 range. We're going to talk more about the younger ages, high school, college. We'll touch on college tonight, but there's some very significant things about those age ranges. Second category, the first was cultural Christians. This is mainstream evangelicals. So this is about 2.5 million people. The second 3 categories are all about 2.5 million. First one was 8 million. This group on the surface looks almost identical to cultural Christians. Very largely white group, 91% white. This one's a little more female than male. Here's the first big difference. Average age their average age is 40. The average age of when they left the church is 37. So they haven't been out of the church 15 years. They've been out of the church 3 to 5 years. That's going to be, if I don't say why that's significant, at some point tonight, ask me. Average income, average education, 97% heterosexual, but then we get to their orthodoxy scores. This orthodoxy score of 86%, that is higher than the orthodoxy score of all the people who still go to church today combined, when you put us all in one big group. 98% of them said, yes, Jesus is the Son of God. 59% believe that the Bible is the literal Word of God. So this group is starting to look like they're Christians. This is a very different group. 100% of this group said, I am willing to go back to church today. So in my own personal ministry, I've got about usually 4 questions. This changes sometimes. And how I can understand what type of de-church person are you. So, in Orlando, it's not that hard. In Memphis, I really don't think it's that hard to raise the question, do you go to church? Is that a very threatening question, do you think, in most Memphis life? Probably not. It wasn't in Oxford. But as is appropriate in the relationship, I'll ask, do you go to church? Now, it's easier because I'm a pastor and I can ask that question, but I think anybody can get to that question. And a lot of, person's going to say, no, I don't go to church. Well, my next question is, did you used to go to church, or did you grow up going to church? And they might say, oh, yeah, I grew up going to church, I don't go anymore. Now I know they're de-churched. They have some category, they're de-churched. I'll ask them, so what caused you to stop going to church? Well, now I know, are they de-churched? Are they casually de-churched, or are they de-churched casualties? And the last question I'll ask, something like, what role does faith play in your life? Who is Jesus to you? Something like that. Mike Graham, he has one question he asks. Are you a person of faith? And he seems to get to the same place. But I use those 4 questions. And what's interesting with this group, once I've identified them, if they live anywhere near our church, this is going on 2.5 years that I've done this now. I'm batting 1,000 on them actually coming. Batting 1,000 when I can identify this group. And usually I know they are before I get to the end of the 4 questions. I'll say, do you go to church? And this group is going to immediately go, no, but I know I should. I know I should. And I don't even really have to go through the rest of the questions. But this group is the lowest hanging fruit. Now, I want to be careful. I don't want to sound like I'm saying, let's just go for the easy stuff. But the lowest hanging fruit matters because statistically speaking, the children of the de-churched, even if they're believers, they are going to be unchurched their whole lives, and the faith, statistically speaking, will not be handed down to them. So when we identify one of these people, it's not just that it's easier to get them in church, it's that this has a generational impact. These people need the church, and their children and grandchildren will be greatly affected by the decision to go back or not. All right, this is where I'm going to come back to the years out that I said, ask me if I don't, but I am here. Again, statistically speaking, the longer you're out of church, the lower your orthodoxy score, which makes a lot of sense. So the more recent a person is de-churched, the more orthodox they are going to be. And so this group, because they've largely been out only 3 to 5 years, is going to still have a high orthodoxy score, still have a high view of the church. Again, they're casually de-churched. They don't have pain points. That's why this group, really all they need is a nudge. When you ask them why they left, I moved to a new community. Attending was inconvenient. COVID got me out of the habit. This is the first group because they were in the habit. COVID came in. They started watching online, whatever. Family issues, divorce, remarriage, or another family change. Number 5, I didn't fit within the congregation. 6, I didn't experience much love within the congregation. So these 2, think about when they de-churched. They were de-churching largely during COVID. So is it any shock that they didn't feel like they didn't fit and they didn't experience much love? Who did in that season? I mean, it was really hard. So That's why they left. When we asked them why they might return, new friends. Again, the same pattern here. Number two, God tells me to go back in some significant way. This is different than the Bible floating on a desk. This is conviction. If I feel it, the way that I know God impresses me, then I will go back. Number three, I find a church I like. Number four, I begin to miss church. So there's not a lot of opposition here. Again, 100% of them said they're willing to go back today. Number five, if they feel the distance from God. Number six, if they can find a good pastor like Matt. Number seven, if they are lonely and want to make new friends, they would go back to church. And then eight, if they find a church that takes both doctrine and ethics seriously. This is interesting because I kind of skipped over this slide. Only 18% of this group would say that issues of race and injustice are rare and isolated in our society. So stated positively, 82% of them say, yeah, they're real issues, ethically, socially, that we as Christians need to address. And I'm not trying to be crass or funny, but because they have the Holy Spirit inside of them, it seems. They care about things that their cultural Christian counterparts do not seem to care about. So if they are going to go back to a church, they're going to want a church where the gospel is intersecting the flourishing of humanity in their community. All right, so what do they need? They need a relational nudge from a church person. They need a church that is going to take doctrine and ethics seriously. They need us to kind of challenge their distance from God and the church. And again, I don't think this is going to take a lot of work, but we as Christians can lean into that a little bit. They also need better engagement in the 18 to 39 age range. Again, that's going to be tomorrow. Those are the four things they need. Third group, ex-evangelicals. When you hear the term ex-evangelical, what descriptors of that person pop into your mind? Just yell some things out. What? Purposely de-churched. Okay, good. But if you could describe the person. Angry. Okay, good. What else? Loud. What? Hurt. Angry, hurt, loud, younger. We hear a lot. Educated. Those would be the things that we hear. What's so interesting is that is not at all what we see in this ex-evangelical category. The stereotypical ex-evangelical is going to be a middle-aged white woman who is less educated and makes less money than any of the other categories. So you can see average age 53, de-churched 20 or more years ago. This group is still largely white, but only 82%. This group has major pain points with the church. They may not be the loud, angry, young intellectual on Twitter, but they have been hurt. They have really been hurt. This group, let's see. Oh, my Siri thinks I'm talking to it. That's what it is. Okay. So this group, 97% of them agree with the statement that Jesus is the Son of God. 90% of them seem to be Christians. Their orthodoxy score is still high, 70%. Only 44% of them believe that the Bible is literal, the literal Word of God. Given how it's phrased, that's still actually pretty good. Above average youth, but low college ministry involvement. They're going to be independent to center-left. U.S. institutions are working badly for them. 18% would say that racial issues are isolated and rare. So again, 82% think that this is something that we need to interact with in our country. Why they left? I didn't fit within the congregation. I moved, that's going to be on a lot of them, to a new community. Number 3, attending was inconvenient. 4, I didn't experience much love within the congregation. 5, I disagreed with the politics of the congregation. This is going to make sense since they're independent, more center-left. And how do I want to say this? There aren't a lot of churches, especially in the era that they were dechurching, that made space for that. Number 6, negative experiences they personally had inside an evangelical church. Number 7, I no longer believed what the congregation believed. That wasn't necessarily theologically. It points more, when we look at the data, to political disagreements. Number 8, I disagreed with the politics of the clergy. So it shows up very clearly there. Why they might return. God tells me to go back in some significant way. I find a church that I like, a good pastor, and this is the first and only time we're going to hear this. 21% said, I'm never going back. Now, when they said they're never going back, they're saying they're never going back to it's a sociological term, a white evangelical church. They would go back to a mainline church. They would go back to a black Protestant church. They would go back to a home or cell church. Now, practically, in our ministry in Orlando, this knowledge has helped us because we've either met people in this category or seen people in our church going down this path. And there are 2 specific churches, well, one church, one diocese, that especially, let me just use the diocese. The Episcopal Diocese in Orlando, while we would practice Christianity, there's some differences in the way that we practice things. That diocese still holds on to the gospel. They are mainline, and they really still hold on to the gospel. And so we've tried to take some of those people that will either never stay in our church or never come into our church because of our complementarian views or whatever it may be, our association with evangelicalism. They will plug into that more mainline, but yet still gospel-centered church. And we've had a lot of success in plugging people into those churches who would never go to our church. So, again, still why they say they might return. Number 5, feel the distance from God. Number 6, I find a church who cares about justice and compassion for vulnerable people, unsurprisingly, because they are vulnerable people. Number 7, a good community. Number 8, if they begin to miss church. What do they need? They need a nonpartisan Christian community. We can talk more about politics in the Q&A if you want, but largely, when we say nonpartisan, a church that understands what are the primary issues, what are the secondary issues, what are the tertiary issues, and where do they rank? And are these issues that we as Christians should be able to worship together and disagree on? Is it a wisdom issue or a doctrine issue? Because there's a big difference between the two. Wisdom issues, the application of wisdom, by definition, gives us freedom to disagree. Number 3, mental health help. Number 4, empathetic community and clergy. All right, BIPOC. Matt, how are we doing on time? How long have I gone?
It's 8:25, so you've gone 55 minutes.
Okay, but I'm going to that's helpful. We'll have plenty of time for Q&A. All right, BIPOC. This one needs more research and is getting it with Mike and Ryan right now. But what's the most fascinating part about this? When we put all this information into machine learning, we hid race and ethnicity from it. It could not see race and ethnicity and still came up with a group that was 0% white. Why do you think, if it didn't know anything about race and ethnicity, that it produced a whole group of 2.5 million people without a single white person in it? What? Any thoughts?
Because there really are cultural
There really are cultural differences.
differences.
A non-white person in, again, sociological term, white evangelicalism, what we are, they're going to have an experience that is unique to them. And so there's a lot more to be learned, but the stereotypical BIPOC dechurched evangelical is going to be an African-American man, let's say in the South, who is making well into his 6 figures. This group is the most educated and highest income earning group of all the four groups. Highest education, above average income. Their orthodoxy scores are not good. 13% would say Jesus is the Son of God. 58 actually isn't a terrible orthodoxy score, but when you zone in on Jesus is the Son of God, you get an idea for where they are. 29% would say the Bible is the literal Word of God. The U.S. institutions don't work well for them, but they have managed to find their place in the United States. Why they left? I moved to a new community. Faith just wasn't working. Number 3, I had other priorities for my time and money. 4, suffering changed my views of God and or the congregation. Number 5, I began to doubt God's existence. Number 6, scandal involving clergy in my congregation. Number 7, I didn't see the congregation doing enough good in the community. Number 8, the messages were not relevant to my life. Which there is something to dial in on later when you want to talk about relevant messages. We can talk about that. All right. So why they might return. 1, new friends, 33%. 2, move and want to make new friends. 3, lonely and want to make new friends. Same theme here. 4, child wants to go. 5, friend invites me. 6, good community. 7, spouse wants to go. 8, feel the distance from God. Now, when we assess what they need, this is a little harder because this group is not monolithic. Some is casually dechurched. Some are dechurched casualties. It's not as nice and homogenous as the other 3, but they need a church with cultural and emotional intelligence, a place where they can make deep friendships, sound doctrine and spiritual formation, and again, better engagement in the 13 and this time to 30 age range. Those are the evangelicals, all right? And that's our space, which is why I want to spend the most time on it with you. Very briefly, mainline and Roman Catholic dechurching look almost the same. So I'm going to fly through mainline. The only difference in mainline, the only significant difference in mainline dechurching and Roman Catholic dechurching, any guess? If you're a mainline person or you grew up in the Roman Catholic Church, what's your main experience? Your felt experience is going to be different. Abuse in the church. Roman Catholics are more affected by church scandal and abuse. Mainline, I moved. But it's going to be more, this group is going to be way more female than male. They have been out of the church for almost 30 years. They're solidly, at least in their early 60s now, high income, or above average income, above average education. What's interesting here is 69%, and this is the same with Catholics too, 69% would still say Jesus is the Son of God. 15% would say the Bible is the literal Word of God. So there's a disparity there that I would say that disparity comes from, I believe in a God, I am friendly with the idea of Jesus, but I don't want to really incorporate the Bible in my life. I want to create a Jesus made in my own image, is largely what's happening with both groups. Their center-left institutions largely work well to them. Why they left, again, all the same things, the only difference, all the same reasons as the other people, friendships, inconvenience, doubt, but the only thing to be different is scandal and abuse with the Roman Catholics. What they need a church with word and deed together, a church that avoids racism, misogyny, and partisan politics, sound doctrine and spiritual formation, and a higher regard for the Bible. All right. If you're not a data person, we're done with data. That's all the data for the rest of our time. The way I want to land the plane here, though, is I want to address, I'm going to say 8 myths. I may add one along the way, but we're going to go with 8. 8 quick myths that we've learned are not true. The first, let's see, get this computer back up. The first myth, here we go. People leave the church because of a negative experience in the church. Again, 30 of the 40 million, that is not the case. Myth number 2, people leave because of secular university. This study was the first one that, to our knowledge, definitively proved that the more education an evangelical has, the more likely they are to continue going to church. So we're not against Christian higher education by any means. We're just saying secular higher education is not the boogeyman that it has been made out to be in evangelicalism. Christian evangelicals with master's degrees are 3 times more likely to continue going to church than their counterparts without. Now, when they go to university, students who are involved in a church and a campus ministry are 3 times more likely to continue going to church afterwards. You take church or campus ministry out, and that plummets. So it makes sense if you think about it, because you have, when a student goes to university, it's such a season of change. They need discipleship during that season. And that's what a lot of the campus ministries did. Campus Crusade, RUF, all the other good ones out there. And now, some churches do have kind of campus ministry level discipleship inside the church, and that would qualify for both. But what happens if these students are only involved in a campus ministry and never experience local church life? They're going to leave college looking for that, same age range, intense discipleship experience among peers, and they're not going to find it. So you take either church or campus ministry out, and it plummets, but nonetheless, it doesn't plummet. It goes from, it's 3 times less likely. But either way, young people are not leaving just because of secular university. You just can't statistically prove it. Number 3, this myth. People leave the church because they left the faith. About 51% really could still be Christians. In evangelicals, among evangelicals, that number's even higher. So there are a lot of people that left the church, but it doesn't seem like they left the faith. Number 4, people are leaving primarily on the secular left. So in the 90s, when you saw that spike, yes, it was largely mainline Roman Catholic dechurching, and they were leaving from the secular left. But when you get over to 2023, the secular right had caught up, completely caught up in total number as the secular left. In the study that's going to come out, you will see, I'm not giving any numbers, trying to steal their thunder, the secular right has now outpaced the secular left in terms of how many people have dechurched in the last 30 years now. Now, again, I'm not trying to get too political, and I have people who love Trump, and we're not offended by this statement, but you think about the Republican Party of the late 90s, still reeling from Bill Clinton's moral scandal. Can you imagine them nominating Donald Trump as their candidate? It would be very hard to imagine that happening then. Things have changed. I'm not making a statement about Donald Trump. Our culture has changed. Now you have so many people leaving on the secular right, it's changing not only our church landscape, but our political landscape as well. Number 5, people aren't willing to come back. Again, 51% of all of the dechurched evangelicals would say they are willing to come back today. So there is a willingness. Number 6, America's peak religiosity was at the time of our founding. So you hear people say, if we could just get back to our founding, they get back to the Christian roots of our founding. And I'm going to say something, but let me first say, I am very thankful for the United States of America. I don't want to live there's so many things that I'm thankful for about this country. But it's hard to argue with the fact that the Constitution of the United States, as brilliant as it is and awesome, was the watershed document into secularism in the West. Like, if you look at the Constitution of the colonies, they are overtly religious. Connecticut talks about Jesus in the Constitution of their colony. There was an active work to get more pluralistic in the way that our founders wrote the Constitution. One example, Thomas Jefferson, when he wrote the famous words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." Does anybody know the original words that he wrote? "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." And Benjamin Franklin said, "That's too Christian. We need to make it more pluralistic." So there was a work. Now, if you just want to talk about percentages, about 34% of Americans today go to church regularly. Do you know what the percentage was in 1776? They actually kept really good church membership records back then. 17% went regularly. So I'm not bashing the origins of our country. I'm simply saying to say we need to go back to the start of our country would not be a good thing for us. And it's kind of a misunderstanding of where we are now. Our peak church attendance was absolutely in the 20th century. We can talk more tomorrow. I would not say that's the peak of Christianity in the United States because of how polluted it got, but the 20th century was our high watermark in terms of attendance. Dechurching is happening primarily to the upwardly mobile. So we have this idea that it's those who are wealthiest who are leaving the church. Absolutely not. The vast majority of the dechurching is happening to the lower educated, lower income group. And it makes sense because if people are leaving more for casual reasons, well, how much is it going to affect? Well, let me go at it from a different direction. This is easier. There is an American path for flourishing. You grow up in a home with two parents. You go to college, then you get married, then you have kids, then you stay married. That's the path to the American life, the American flourishing, whatever. You get off that path at some point, it gets harder for you. So if you become a single parent for whatever reason, if you lose a parent for whatever reason, if you have to, share custody, work two jobs, work odd hours, work on Sunday, or hand off a child on Sunday, church gets really hard for you. So it's those lower income, lower education brackets that are hit more significantly by dechurching. The sad part of this, that's sad already. A really sad part, and probably an indictment on us, is that when you go back to the early church, who flocked to the church? Like, who did the church work best for? The poor, the disenfranchised, the slave, the sick, the women, the people that society had deemed outside of their path. That's who the church worked best for. Now, what we see clearly in the data, the people the church worked best for in the beginning, we're not working for them anymore. And we need to think about what that looks like in our context. All right, I'm going to end with this. Myth number 8, all is lost. Absolutely not true. You look globally. There are more Christians alive today than there were from the Apostle Paul to the 1800s combined. More Christians alive today than the first 1800 years of New Testament Christianity. What most Americans don't necessarily feel is that most of that boom is in the global East and the global South. So we're a small part of the world. The world does not center. The world does not rise and fall on, I got to be careful about this. The United States has been very important to the spread of that Christianity, and I don't want to minimize that in any way. But God is not dependent on the United States of America for what he's doing, and Christianity is booming in the global East and the global South. Coming back here to the United States, I would argue that there is a sort of purification that is happening where, in the 20th century, you went to church because you wanted your business to flourish, because you wanted to run for office, because you wanted your kids to make the right kind of friendships, because you wanted to get into certain country clubs or racket clubs. Well, church doesn't matter for those things anymore. And so by and large, in most, especially evangelical churches, people go to church. Why? Because of Jesus. And so there is this, it's kind of, I'm sad that people aren't in church, but the truth is our friend. To be able to know who is a Christian and who is not is helpful for us in the mission that we're called to as local churches, as gospel outposts in our parts of our cities. So I think that all is not lost. I think that there's a lot of good that's going on. Again, tomorrow we're going to get more practical in a number of different areas. In our last session, we're going to get really practical in one area that is very new and I haven't written on or published, and I'm excited about that. But I'll stop, and we can just questions on any of these. If you ask a really practical question, I may say we're going to get into it tomorrow. But clarifications, questions, anything from what we've gone through so far? Yes. That's a good question. So the question is on the graph, the religiosity and the relationship between the religiosity and the economic development of countries. How does that apply to the United States? To be clear, I'm not saying the United States is free falling right now. I'm just saying how far we could go. That's the kind of data that Mike and Ryan are going to have in the next study. Regionally, because you did ask regionally, I can at least say dechurching was what we expected in the South. It's really high because we had more people going to church. It was what we expected in the Northeast. Not a lot of people going to church. It was just kind of what we expected in terms of dechurching. The West was actually better than we thought it would be. There aren't a lot of Christians. I mean, there are a lower number of Christians in the West, but they were holding on a little better than we expected, and the Midwest was much worse than we had expected. So that's the best regional answer I can give you that, but I know that in Mike and Ryan's study, they're going to have more granular information. Yes?
I don't know if y'all studies specified it specifically, but did y'all see any difference between people that might claim they've been hurt by God or if they've been hurt by bad Christians?
So if they've been hurt by God or bad Christians? Or are you asking if they're casting their blame at God versus other Christians? That is a really good question. We didn't ask questions that... No, we did. I mean, that would be, there were some people that would talk about clergy hurt or not fitting in within their congregation. And then we had suffering that doesn't. Yeah, I don't know that we asked a question that would, because it's a study of belonging. You're asking a lot of my social science right now, but let me see if I can pull it out. So you have belief, belong, and behave. Those are the three categories for social science. This is a belonging study because it's are you in a church or not, where we do get some information about both behavior and belief, but the question you're asking would fall in a belief study. It's a good question, but that's why we don't have the answer to that one. Are mega churches contributing to the dechurching phenomenon? I'm just trying to decide if I want to go there now or tomorrow. How about this? Let me wait until tomorrow, and if I don't answer that I'm going to answer that. If you have more questions, ask. But see, if I answer that now, then you're just stealing my thunder for tomorrow. But it's a really important question. Yeah. Yeah, so how does the data apply to, it looks like there are churches that both have a lot of people in them, and you see new churches popping up in different places. So I'll say one thing on that because we are going to cover that again tomorrow as well. Are you going to be here tomorrow? Is that? Oh, all right, well. So there's been this interesting migration. The average size church in the United States is about 70 people. 80% of the United States goes to large churches. So 80% are in large churches. Now, there are a lot of sociological reasons for that. My understanding is it's somewhere between 600 and 800. But I'd want to go fact check that before I would put that out. But it's somewhere between 600 and 800 to be a large church. 80% of the people in America go to large churches. All right, you're not going to be here tomorrow. So you're asking, so there was a Lifeway study that I'll reference tomorrow that, let me see if I can find it. So in Lifeway, in 2014, 300 more churches closed, 300 more churches more, all right, let me start that over. 300 more churches opened than closed. 2019, 1,500 more churches closed than opened. That's before COVID, and they haven't done the study again. So yes, there are churches popping up, but there's so many more closing. And I've got lots of mixed thoughts on that, but yeah, so that's a good question because that is talking about numbers of churches, not numbers of people. Good distinction. The numbers of people are still going down. Both are going down. Having said that, I think a lot of the churches are closing for a reason. Some have let go of the gospel, and I'm fine that they close. If they don't return to the gospel, that's by and large not a bad thing for the kingdom. You have some churches that just seem to have run their local church course. I don't know another way to say that. They are the average ages are very old, and their methods maybe aren't methods that we would use. The preaching style, maybe they believe the gospel, but maybe the gospel isn't very clear. There can be circumstances of the community around them changing drastically. But I do think there's great opportunities, too, for those churches that want to be relevant and have a gospel witness for them to partner with a church plant. There's a church just down the street from us that was an old, dying church. And I was talking to the pastor. He's like, I don't know what to do. And I was like, there's a church in the YMCA that's awesome. What about putting them in your building? And it was this beautiful, it is this beautiful relationship that I reference in the book, and then it became a bigger story after that through somebody else with a bigger platform. But in any case, yeah, it's hard because there are Christians moving around. There are people not going to church, but the people who are moving around are flocking to churches largely bigger than what they're experiencing. Now, you do see some people, a church grows, and they want to get back to the size that it started, but they're not going to a smaller church than they entered into in the beginning. So let's say, is that confusing? It's hard. I don't know if you've ever read Tim Keller's Church Size and Leadership Dynamics. It's more of like an article, long article. And he talks about the different church sizes. And of course, he planted and went to a very large size. And he says that we tend to moralize sizes of churches. And he pushes us not to moralize sizes of churches, but to assess the church on its own merit in terms of what it's doing. Because there are some larger churches, I think his was one, they did foster community. They did the best they could in New York City with large people, but they valued community. and we tend to moralize. Some people say smaller church is better because you have more relationships, or larger church is better because you have more programs, missional opportunities, raising kids. We want them in a community of like-minded kids. Keller would say, we shouldn't moralize these things. It's not necessarily good or bad, but there is a better for us. So different people are made different ways, but we also tend to moralize the how do I want to say this? I wish I could remember how he said this, but we tend to prefer the size the church was when we entered it. So we're experiencing that right now. We have people, our church is growing, and I might fall into that category myself. I kind of prefer where we were at a different size. It's not necessarily bad that we're larger, but there's a preference there, and it's okay to have preferences on that. I hate that I'm not going to hate for you, I'm not diving into your first question because I'm really excited about that, but these are really good questions.
Hey, I have two kind of demographic questions. The first, and I appreciate how you went into the 4 groups. If we zoom out a little bit and look male versus female, are there some helpful takeaways there? I find it interesting that women are generally viewed as more religious, and yet 2 of the 4 groups were more heavily comprised of women. And then the second demographic is, was there anything compelling on children of divorce as it relates to Dechurching?
I don't know about, I'm going to go in reverse order. And are you here tomorrow?
Yeah.
I can text Ryan Burge, and he will know the answer off the top of his head. But so children of divorced parents, there are statistics out there. I hear these wildly, you hear things like children who grow up with a dad are like 80% more likely to go to church. I've read evidence that says that's not true, but at the same time, dads matter. Like it may not be that big, but that matters. In terms of divorce, I don't have solid data. I have thoughts, anecdotal, but I'm kind of interested because that's a really good question. So I'll text Ryan and see if he has something tomorrow. The first question you asked was male versus female. In terms of who's still going to church and who's holding on?
Or if there were just interesting takeaways, surprising things from the data. It seemed like more women are Dechurched than men based on the 4 profiles here.
Yeah, there are more women Dechurching. Okay, there's a lot of different intersections here with the vibe shift and I'm using air quotes, Gen Z revival. Air quotes for a reason. I'm not down on it, but I'm not sold on it yet. But I think with some of these people, like let's just take the ex-evangelicals. There are some things, and I'm not trying to make big gender stereotypes, but I still believe we are ontologically made differently. There's some places that in a very good way, I feel like women have rightly less of a tolerance for some of the bad things that have happened in our churches. And I think that plays into the data with the ex-evangelicals, whereas you get into the cultural Christians and it's largely males. But they just left for whatever reason. Like the females are leaving for, the data says, more reasonable reasons in the evangelical space, especially in the ex-evangelical space, and a little bit in the mainstream Christian space, mainstream evangelical space. Was there a question back there? No? Okay. Yes?
You think about the categories of visible church and the invisible church. It seems like there's a group of de-church that would still be a part of the invisible church. But would you expect, because of this whole de-churching movement, that number is just going to increase because of the values and traditions not being passed down to the generations?
Yeah, that is a really good question. So visible and invisible church, yes, I do believe that there are people who don't go to church that are a part of the invisible church. statistically speaking, their children will likely not be a part of visible or invisible church.
If you take a different definition of Christian, in other words, not just someone who casually goes to church and have this really broad standard, but someone who's serious about their faith, back then and now, do you think that percentage has changed if you look at a tighter definition of what counts?
Like from like the 1700s to now, or the 20th century.
Some other period when there was less.
All right. So the question is, if you go back in time. All right. Say it one more time, because I'm.
So if you pick some time before this spike in Dechurching
Yeah.
took place, and you use a different definition for what counts as somebody who would be claims to be serious about, who's someone who's serious about their faith, which would obviously exclude a bunch of people that you count as churched back then and now. Is the core number of people who are really serious about their faith doing the same trend, or are we just getting rid of the people who casually go to church and don't really mean it?
Yeah, I mean, I do think there are a lot. If you define it as going to church, you'd have a lot more in the 20th century. But I also think if we did this study in the 20th century, you'd see a lot of people going to church who don't actually believe what the church believes. And so now we're still doing a belonging study. We're still using the same, like, how often are you going to church? But among those who go to church now, the orthodoxy scores are much higher than probably we've seen, at least in the mid to late 20th century, I think. Because because the mainline church was starting to let go of different things. I mean, it all really started, one of the turning points, that's a better way to say it, was with the rise of the Darwinianism, the scientific revolution, an effort to, well, of course, some of this goes back to the Jefferson Bible. How do we take what is, the things that we like about Christian morals and separate them from the things that, we can't observe with science to try and preserve the Christian faith. Now, that did more harm than good to the Christian faith, but it opened the doors for a lot of people who felt really free to be in the church and be around Christian values, teaching Christian values, but there was a freedom to let go of, like, those miracles that we didn't really believe. Does that make sense? So in the 20th century, I think you had a higher number of people who went to church, appreciated Christian values, but did not believe some of the core tenets that we believe, whether it's virgin birth, resurrection, exclusivity of Jesus, those kinds of things.
So probably weren't really Christian.
I don't think so. Yeah, I think the 20th century made it on the positive. Let me say a positive and negative. Positive, it created a culture where a lot of non-Christians were able to be in church. On the negative, it created a church where it was very comfortable for non-Christians to be in there often. I'm,
Where did you pull a lot of your names? You said this was the biggest thing of, I can't remember the exact timeline, but I'm curious, like, in between your study, like, of the present, where were you pulling a lot of that data from before? I know you said, like, earlier they had really great records, but I don't imagine that was kept up.
yeah. Okay, so where are we pulling our data from? So this is good. So there's a couple different pieces to understand. So the survey obviously was done through Qualtrics, the same way that political surveys, voting surveys, all those things are done. Like that part of the data came from there. There is something called the CSS they've been tracking religious data for 100 years. And so we have access to that, the CSS, so we can compare. That's why when part of the academy, you have to get permission academically that the science is good before you can go and do the survey. And part of the academic side of it, before you can do it, they want to know that we're going to ask questions in a similar way, so that we can accurately compare to 100 years worth of surveys. Now, with the early church, the early American church, we have access to, I mean, it really, I did not know this until we started on this project, but late 1700s, they have really good attendance records from, they're really good. They've been stored. Some of them are like in the National Library of Congress, but we just have access to that. Does that answer your, so it's kind of different places, yeah.
We have time for one more.
One more question. Yes?
What, you said that you had maybe a ninth myth?
Yeah, I had one more thing that I was going to say that I'm going to put tomorrow.
Okay.
So it was in the realm of friendships, but I'm friendships matter. Relationships really matter. Whatever our strategy is for going and reaching the lost in our city, relationships really matter. It doesn't mean that some of the other things we can do don't matter. Relationships matter more than any other measurable human strategy. And we're going to talk more about relationships. Talk a little bit more in the first one, and really the last session is all about relationships. All right?
Would you be willing to close us in prayer?
I would love to.
We can wrap it up.
I would love to. God, I am really thankful for this church. Just giving up a Friday evening, a Saturday morning. I am so encouraged by their presence here, and I just want to pray every blessing on them. I just thank you for the ways, not just that they're here physically, but mentally, the ways that they are thinking through this. And I want to pray that that you would give this church wisdom, because it's not, what we're talking about has to be filtered through a local context. And just pray that you would bless this church and their efforts to walk with you, flourish as a community, and be a mission, a gospel missions outpost in Midtown. I'm really thankful for the people here, some very old friendship, at least one here, and what you're doing. So I pray that you would bless their trips home, their evenings, and we love you, and we ask this in the power of your Holy Spirit and in the name of your Holy Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you, Jim. Quick housekeeping. 9 o'clock, we're back here tomorrow morning. We'll have breakfast, and it'll be 30 minutes to kind of get your mind just get on. And then he will start at 9:30. So we'll see if we want to pick up something.
I was, yeah. Nope, sorry, I'm still on.
So when were you instructed?